What if an entire city richer than gold, crowned with towering pillars, vanished overnight without leaving a single trace? Ubar, the fabled Atlantis of the sands, was said to command the desert's most powerful trade routes. Until the dunes swallowed it whole, was it divine punishment? A sinkhole the size of a kingdom? Or something far stranger? Keep watching, because once you step into its mystery, there's no turning back. They say the desert forgets nothing, but it hides everything. Somewhere beyond the last green fringe of Oman's Dhofar region, deep in the shifting sands of the Rub al-Khali, there may lie the ruins of a city whispered about for over 1,000 years. Ubar, the fabled Atlantis of the sands. For generations, it was a name passed from one traveler to another, woven into Bedouin stories, praised in poetry, and immortalized in the Qur'an as Iram of the pillars, the like of which had never been seen in any land. It was said to be a city of immense wealth and towering pride, destroyed in an instant, swallowed by the desert as punishment for its arrogance. By the late 20th century, Ubar was not just a legend, it was an obsession. Explorers, scholars, and dreamers all wanted to be the one to find it. But in 1992, the world thought the mystery had finally been solved. An international team of archaeologists, aided by advanced satellite imaging from NASA, announced that they had located its remains in a remote site called Shisr, in Oman's Dhofar province. The evidence seemed convincing at first. At Shisr, they uncovered collapsed stone walls, the remnants of a fortified structure, and a deep well, all signs of an ancient settlement. The most tantalizing clue came from above. Radar images showed faint, almost ghostly lines stretching out in multiple directions from the site, like spokes from the hub of a wheel. These were believed to be the traces of ancient caravan tracks, worn into the desert by centuries of camels, carrying one of the most precious goods of the ancient world, frankincense. And all of those tracks converged at Shisr. The story was irresistible. Newspapers and television networks called it a historic discovery. Oman celebrated, seeing in the find not just an archaeological breakthrough, but a reaffirmation of its place in the rich tapestry of Arabian history. For many, the case was closed. Ubar had been found at last. But almost immediately, cracks appeared in the narrative. Skeptical voices in the archaeological community began to speak up. They argued that what had been found at Shisr was not the sprawling, magnificent city described in scripture and legend, but something far more modest, a small fort or caravanserai, a kind of desert truck stop for the camel caravans moving through the frankincense trade route. The entire site, they pointed out, was tiny compared to what you'd expect from a city of Ubar's supposed grandeur. There were no traces of monumental architecture, no towering stone pillars, no vast residential quarters. Some went further, suggesting that the fort itself might be far younger than Ubar's supposed timeline, perhaps dating to the early Islamic period rather than the distant age of the people of Ad. In other words, it might not have been Ubar at all, just another stop along an ancient road, mistaken for a lost metropolis because we wanted the story to be true. The debate quickly split into two camps. On one side were those convinced Shisr was the real thing, that its modest size was due to centuries of erosion, collapse, and burial beneath the sand. On the other were those who saw it as a romantic misidentification, a case of wishful thinking bolstered by clever public relations. And then there were the alternative theories. If Shisr was not Ubar, where else could the city be? Some researchers have pointed to Yemen, whose Hadramaut region is rich in ancient ruins and lies squarely along the old incense trade routes. Others have proposed sites in the United Arab Emirates, where Bronze Age settlements hint at long-lost trading hubs. Still others believe Ubar lies deep within the Rub al-Khali itself, in regions so remote and inhospitable that no comprehensive excavation has ever been attempted. The problem is that proving any of these theories is almost impossibly hard. The Arabian Desert is one of the most dynamic landscapes on Earth. Sand dunes move. Storms shift entire ridgelines overnight. What is visible one season can vanish the next, only to reappear years later. Even with modern technology, high-resolution satellite imagery, ground-penetrating radar, aerial drones, the desert's surface plays tricks on the eye. Natural formations carved by wind and ancient floodwaters can mimic the straight lines of roads or the angles of walls. Without physical excavation, the truth remains uncertain. Complicating matters further is the nature of the source material. Outside of the Qur'an and later Arabic law, there are no contemporary written records that clearly describe Ubar or pinpoint its location. That leaves a wide gap for interpretation and for speculation. Was Ubar truly a single city, as the popular image suggests? Or was it a name for an entire region? Or a collective term for multiple trade outposts strung like pearls along the desert routes? Some historians suspect that Ubar may never have been a fixed place at all, but rather a concept, a center of trade whose exact position shifted over time as resources and politics changed. What is certain is that the frankincense trade was real, and it was vast. In the ancient world, frankincense and myrrh were more valuable than gold. They were used in temples, burned in palaces, and traded across continents. Whoever controlled the points along that trade network grew rich and powerful. A place like Ubar, real or not, would have been a crucial link in this chain, and perhaps that is why so many still search for it. The NASA radar imagery remains one of the most fascinating pieces of the puzzle. Those bright streaks etched into the desert floor are undeniable. To supporters of the Shisr theory, they are the literal roads to Ubar, carved by centuries of caravans. To skeptics, they could just as easily be the remnants of ancient riverbeds or the work of prevailing winds, aligning by chance in ways that look deliberate from above. Even NASA scientists have admitted that interpreting such features is tricky business, and that without ground surveys to confirm them, they remain intriguing possibilities rather than proof. More than 30 years after the announcement at Shisr, there is still no scholarly consensus. Excavations at the site have provided valuable information about local history, trade, and settlement patterns. But none of it has definitively answered the question, is this truly Ubar? And so the mystery continues. The empty quarter remains largely unexplored, not because of lack of interest, but because of the sheer logistical and environmental challenges it poses. Temperatures soar, water is scarce, and shifting sands can swallow vehicles and equipment. Mounting a deep desert expedition requires resources on the scale of a major scientific mission, and the will to spend them on a prize that may or may not exist. Yet the idea refuses to die. Something about Ubar captures the imagination in a way few other lost places do. Perhaps it's the combination of religious reference, oral tradition, and the romance of the desert. Perhaps it's the tantalizing hints, the tracks, the ruins, the legends that suggest truth buried somewhere beneath centuries of sand. Or perhaps it's simply human nature. We are drawn to mysteries and to the hope that we might be the ones to solve them. For now, the site at Shisr still stands in the middle of Oman's desert, marked by the remains of its ancient well and low stone walls. Tourists visit, guides tell stories, and somewhere in the background, the debate hums on. Is this the resting place of the Atlantis of the sands? Or is it just another way station on a road long vanished? Until the sands shift again, until new technology or a bold expedition reveals more, the exact location of Ubar will remain what it has always been, an open question, suspended between history and myth, waiting for the desert to give up its secrets. They say a legend can travel farther than any caravan and last longer than any empire. The name Ubar has crossed centuries and continents, carried on the tongues of traders, whispered by desert guides, and recorded in Holy Scripture. But here's the question that keeps archaeologists, historians, and storytellers divided. Was Ubar ever truly a single, living city, or is it a poetic mirage, stitched together from faith, memory, and myth? In the Qur'an, Ubar appears under another name, Iram of the Pillars. The verses describe it as a city unlike any other, built by the ancient people of Ad, a civilization proud and powerful. Its lofty pillars stood as symbols of its greatness, visible across the horizon, unmatched anywhere else in the world, and then it was gone. According to scripture, divine punishment fell upon the people of Ad for their arrogance. A windstorm, violent and unrelenting, buried their city beneath the sands, erasing it from the earth in a matter of days. That's the religious account, vivid, morally charged, unforgettable. It's also the foundation for nearly every modern search for Ubar. But outside of the Qur'an and early Arabic oral traditions, there are no surviving written records that mention Iram in such detail, no inscriptions carved into stone that proclaim its name, no tablets cataloging its rulers, no papyrus scrolls describing its markets or monuments. This absence leaves the door wide open for interpretation and for disagreement. For many believers, the lack of outside sources doesn't diminish the reality of Ubar, it reinforces its mystique. After all, the desert is ruthless. Time and wind can erase entire cities without leaving so much as a brick above ground. If a city fell to the sands thousands of years ago, perhaps the absence of written testimony is exactly what we should expect. But for historians trained to weigh every claim against physical evidence, the picture is more complicated. They ask, what if Ubar wasn't a city at all? Some scholars argue that Ubar may have been the name of a region, not a settlement, much like the Levant or the Silk Road. In this view, Ubar could have referred to the entire area where the people of Ad lived, traded, and traveled. Over time, the idea of a region might have been distilled in memory into a single, dazzling capital, easier to tell as a story, easier to remember. Others push the idea even further. Perhaps Ubar was never meant to be a fixed location on a map. Instead, it might have been shorthand for a trade network, the critical juncture where caravans carrying frankincense from the south met with buyers bound for the Mediterranean, Persia, and beyond. In that sense, Ubar could have been dozens of places over centuries, as shifting politics, climate, and resources moved the routes from one oasis to another. This theory has its appeal, because it neatly explains why every attempt to find Ubar uncovers something different: a fort here, an abandoned well there, a scattering of pottery somewhere else. If Ubar was never a single permanent city, then of course we can't locate its exact spot. There was no spot to begin with. Yet, for all the modern skepticism, the image of a singular lost city refuses to fade. Part of this is the power of storytelling. One glittering capital, doomed in a single catastrophic event, makes for a far more gripping tale than a network of outposts slowly shifting over time. Human beings crave a center, a place to pin the legend, and then there's the matter of those lofty pillars described in the Qur'an. Were they real architectural structures, massive stone or wooden columns rising from palaces and temples? Or were they metaphorical, a symbolic way to describe the strength and stature of the people of Ad? If they were real, what happened to them? Stone weathers, but it takes an immense force, natural or human, to erase all trace of monumental columns. Unless, of course, they were made of a material that couldn't survive centuries under sand. Some researchers have suggested they might have been wooden beams, ornate but perishable. Others wonder if pillars referred not to buildings at all, but to the towering sandstone formations found in parts of southern Arabia, natural features that might have inspired the city's poetic description. This uncertainty about the pillars leads to another question: how much of the Iram story is history, and how much is allegory? In religious texts, cities often stand for more than themselves. They become symbols of virtue, of sin, of divine justice. Was Iram one such symbol? A narrative device to convey moral lessons, later mistaken by later generations for a literal geographic location? For those who approach Ubar through the lens of faith, this line of questioning can feel beside the point. Whether Iram was a physical city or a metaphor, the lessons drawn from its story remain potent. But for archaeologists, the difference matters. Without distinguishing between symbol and structure, the search risks chasing shadows. Interestingly, this isn't the first time a civilization has wrestled with the blurred line between legend and geography. Think of Troy. For centuries, it was known primarily through Homer's epic poetry. Many dismissed it as fiction until excavations in the 19th century revealed the ruins of a real city in modern-day Turkey. The truth turned out to be more complex. Troy existed, but its actual history was interwoven with centuries of myth-making. Could Ubar be another Troy, waiting for the right spade in the right place to prove it was more than a story? Or perhaps it's closer to El Dorado, the mythical golden city of South America. In that case, there was never a single place matching the legend, just many smaller truths that, combined and exaggerated, produced the irresistible myth. The same could be true for Ubar: a little history, a little commerce, a lot of storytelling. One compelling aspect of the region theory is that it fits neatly with what we know about ancient Arabian trade. Frankincense and myrrh weren't gathered from a single city. They came from groves spread across Yemen and Oman, carried by caravans that stopped at multiple oases before reaching the Mediterranean world. Control over such trade wasn't fixed. It shifted with alliances, wars, and climate changes. In such a fluid environment, the idea of a single eternal capital seems less likely than a network of changing hubs. Yet, oral tradition can be stubborn. Over generations, the names of many small places can collapse into one. A traveler's tale about the great market in Ubar might, centuries later, be understood as a reference to a specific city, even if Ubar once meant nothing more specific than the lands of the incense traders. The absence of physical evidence for a grand city might not disprove its existence. It might only mean we've been looking in the wrong way. If Iram was real, it might now lie deep beneath dunes that have shifted hundreds of meters since ancient times. The Arabian desert is an archivist with no interest in easy retrieval. What it buries it keeps well hidden. This brings us to a paradox. The very mystery that keeps Ubar alive in our imaginations is the same thing that may prevent us from ever finding it. If tomorrow, an archaeologist uncovered an inscription reading "Welcome to Ubar" in 3 languages, the legend would be over, replaced by a fixed set of coordinates. Some might welcome that closure, others would feel the magic dim. So, was Ubar a real city or a legend? The most honest answer is that it may be both. It could have been a real place, perhaps many places, whose memory was shaped and reshaped over centuries until it became a single, shimmering idea in the collective imagination. The people of Ad, if they existed as described, might have built impressive structures, traded vast wealth, and then, through some combination of disaster and time, vanished from the surface. The storytellers who came after would have done what storytellers always do. They distilled the scattered memories into a narrative arc, complete with moral lessons and dramatic imagery. And so the search continues, driven as much by the need to satisfy human curiosity as by the desire to confirm or deny scripture. Satellite scans, drone surveys, and the desert expeditions may one day pin Ubar down to a single spot on the map. Or they may prove that the city was never just one place at all. Until then, Iram of the Pillars remains suspended between 2 worlds, the tangible realm of archaeology and the boundless peace of myth. It stands in our minds, if not in the sand, as both a cautionary tale and a beacon, luring each new generation of explorers to test the shifting edge where history and legend meet. And maybe that's the real heart of the mystery. Not whether Ubar was bricks and mortar or wind and words, but the fact that thousands of years later, we are still asking the question. They say the desert gives nothing for free. Every drop of water, every patch of shade, every moment of survival, all of it is borrowed. And sooner or later, the desert always collects its debt. For Ubar or Ira of the Pillars, that debt came due in a single, devastating moment. Or at least, that's how the story has been told for over 1,000 years. In the Qur'an and in the old Bedouin tales, the end of Ubar was no gradual decline, no slow decay over generations. It was swift, absolute, and final. In the legendary version, the city's destruction was not caused by mere chance or natural disaster. It was an act of divine judgment. The people of Ad, blessed with wealth and power, grew arrogant. They believed their towering pillars and vast markets made them untouchable. They ignored the warnings of the prophet Hud, who called on them to turn away from their pride and corruption. And then the punishment came not from an enemy army, but from the sky itself. A windstorm, violent beyond imagining, swept over the city. For days or perhaps weeks, depending on the telling, it howled without pause. Sand and dust blotted out the sun. Roofs were torn away. Pillars cracked and fell. The very air became a weapon, scouring the streets clean. And when it finally ended, there was nothing left but dunes. Where once the city had stood, Ubar had been swallowed whole, erased from the world as if it had never been. In this telling, the desert itself becomes the instrument of God's will, a force that can both sustain life and take it away in an instant. It's a story designed to endure, a warning carried on the wind to every generation that follows no city, no matter how great, can defy humility and survive. But legends, however powerful, always invite the question, could something like this actually happen? Could an entire city really vanish into the sand? The scientific theories offer their own possibilities. And while they may lack the moral drama of the legendary account, they're no less striking. One of the most compelling is the sinkhole hypothesis. According to this idea, Ubar's fate was sealed not by a storm from above, but by the ground beneath it. Much of southern Arabia sits atop layers of limestone and gypsum rocks that can dissolve over time when exposed to water. Beneath the surface, natural cavities and underground chambers can form, invisible until the weight above becomes too great. When that happens, the ground can collapse suddenly, swallowing whatever stands on it. For a city like Ubar, built around a central water source, a deep well, or a series of cisterns, this was more than possible. Over centuries, the constant drawing of water could have eroded the rock beneath, hollowing it out. One day, perhaps triggered by a minor earthquake or the sheer strain of its own weight, that hollow might have given way. Streets, walls, and towers could have plunged into the earth in a matter of moments. From the surface, it would have looked as if the city had been swallowed, a vivid image that easily fits both the scientific and legendary accounts. In fact, at the Shisr site, the place some believe to be Ubar, researchers found evidence of exactly this kind of geological collapse. The ruins stand at the edge of a large depression, a sinkhole roughly the size of a football field. Its edges are jagged, the rock beneath fractured and unstable. If the settlement had extended across this cavity in the past, it's not hard to imagine how a collapse could have destroyed much of it. Still, a sinkhole explains only part of the mystery. If the city was truly as large and magnificent as legend claims, could one collapse have erased it entirely? That's where another factor comes in: overexploitation of resources. Life in the desert depends on water. Every well is a lifeline, and every oasis is a treasure. But water is not infinite, especially in a climate as dry as the empty quarter. If Ubar sat at a key point on the frankincense trade route, its population may have grown faster than its water supply could handle. Caravans passing through would have drawn heavily on the wells. Livestock would have needed watering. As the years went by, the water table might have dropped. Wells would have had to be dug deeper and deeper, accelerating the erosion of the rock below. Once the wells ran dry or became too dangerous to maintain, the city's days were numbered. Without water, trade would move elsewhere. Without trade, the wealth that sustained Ubar would vanish. In this scenario, the city might have already been in decline when the final collapse, whether sinkhole or storm, delivered the finishing blow. There's another theory that blends elements of both the legend and the science: the sandstorm-triggered collapse. Picture this: a city already weakened by geological instability and a dwindling water supply. Then, one season, an unrelenting sandstorm sweeps through. The wind strips away protective layers of soil, exposing the fragile limestone beneath. Days of pounding wind and abrasive sand undermine the structural integrity of the ground. And then suddenly, sections of the city floor give way. The destruction would be both dramatic and total, leaving nothing visible above the surface. Such events aren't confined to legend. In recent history, smaller settlements in desert regions have been buried by shifting dunes in a matter of months. In Namibia, entire colonial-era towns now lie under hills of sand. In China's Taklamakan Desert, the remains of ancient Silk Road cities have been uncovered, only to be reburied by storms a season later. In the Sahara, there are oases that appear on maps for a decade or two, then disappear again as the sands move. The difference with Ubar is scale, both in the size of the city as imagined and in the totality of its disappearance. It's one thing for part of a town to be buried, quite another for every trace to be erased so completely that, centuries later, we can't say for certain where it was. Some geologists studying the Dhofar region point to a long-term shift in climate as another possible culprit. Thousands of years ago, parts of Arabia were far greener than they are today. Monsoon rains reached further inland, supporting pastures, trees, and even small rivers. But around 3000 BCE, that climate began to change. The rains retreated south, the land dried. What had been fertile became arid. If Ubar thrived in a wetter era, its survival would have been directly threatened by this slow-motion catastrophe. In that context, the sudden disappearance might actually have been centuries in the making. Trade routes would have shifted gradually. Wells would have yielded less each year. Families would have moved away, seeking better land. By the time the final blow came, whether from sinkhole, storm, or both, the city might have been a shadow of itself, ready to vanish from both sight and memory. Of course, for storytellers, gradual decline lacks the drama of divine retribution. And so, in the retelling, centuries of change compress into a single moment of wrath. The storm becomes the centerpiece, the symbol. The moral becomes clear. Pride comes before the fall, and the fall can be absolute. Interestingly, these two narratives, the legendary and the scientific, don't have to cancel each other out. In many ways, they can coexist. A sandstorm that lasts days could easily be interpreted as divine punishment by those who lived through it. A sinkhole that swallows part of a city could be remembered as the earth itself turning against the arrogant. Over generations, these memories could merge, producing the enduring image of a city swallowed whole by the desert as the sky raged above it. When we strip away the centuries of retelling, what we're left with is this Ubar's disappearance. However it happened, left an impression deep enough to survive in memory long after its stones were gone. That in itself is extraordinary. In a land where wind and heat erase the works of human hands faster than anywhere else on Earth, the story of Ubar has lasted reshaped, reinterpreted, but never forgotten. And perhaps that's why, even without definitive proof, the search for Ubar's fate continues. Because every possibility divine storm, sinkhole collapse, slow drought carries within it the kind of drama that stirs the imagination. Maybe the real answer will someday come from a new excavation, or from technology capable of peering beneath the dunes without disturbing them. Ground-penetrating radar, seismic mapping, or even AI analysis of satellite imagery might pinpoint where Ubar once stood and reveal the scars of whatever destroyed it. Until then, Ubar's end remains a riddle with two faces, one looking up to the heavens for judgment, the other down into the earth for collapse. Somewhere between those two lies the truth and the desert, as always, is in no hurry to give it away. They say a city is remembered not for its walls, but for what rises above them. For Ubar, or Iram of the Pillars, it was the lofty columns, the like of which were never seen in any land. As the Qur'an tells us, this single detail has become the most enduring image of the city tall, proud, visible for miles across the desert horizon. A city crowned with monuments so unique that they became its very identity. And yet, after decades of searching in Oman, in Yemen, in the empty quarter, no such pillars have ever been unearthed. It's a mystery that sits right at the heart of Ubar's story. If these monumental columns were truly real, where are they now? And if they were not, why have they endured so vividly in legend? The verses that mention Iram's pillars are steeped in poetry. You can almost see them, great shafts of stone or wood catching the morning sun. Shadows stretching across the packed earth of the marketplace. The air thick with the scent of frankincense and myrrh. They are the kind of detail that fixes a city in the imagination. That makes it feel tangible. But poetry is a double-edged sword. In ancient writing, especially in sacred texts, a pillar can be literal architecture, or it can be metaphor. It can mean power, stability, a dynasty, or even a tribe. A ruler might be called a pillar without ever standing beneath one. If the pillars of Iram were real, they must have been remarkable. Arabia has a long tradition of monumental architecture. In Yemen, the Temple of the Moon at Marib once boasted tall, finely carved columns that still stand in partial ruin today. Across the region, from the colonnades of Petra to the hypostyle halls of Egypt, pillars have been the ultimate symbol of permanence. To raise one in the desert was to defy the shifting sands. To say, "We are here and we are not leaving." For a city like Iram, these pillars would have been both a practical and a symbolic statement, supporting vast roofs, shading courtyards, marking ceremonial spaces, and telling every caravan that passed through that they had reached a center of wealth and power. And yet, permanence is an illusion in the desert. If they were made of stone, perhaps the pillars were toppled in the city's destruction, fractured into blocks, and reused in other buildings. A fallen column can be cut into smaller sections for walls, wells, or steps. Over 1,000 years, the original shape becomes unrecognizable, scattered across villages and ruins far from its birthplace. It is possible that the pillars of Iram still exist, just not in any form that would make us recognize them. If they were made of wood, the mystery becomes easier to explain, but harder to romanticize. Monumental timber columns, perhaps carved from palm trunks or imported cedar from the Levant, would have been easier to erect, lighter to transport, and perhaps quicker to replace. But under centuries of shifting sand and blistering heat, wood leaves almost no trace. Unless post holes or soil discolorations are carefully recorded during excavation, the memory of such structures can vanish completely. This would fit the archaeological silence we have so far, but it would mean that the most famous image of Ubar was a vision of organic, impermanent beauty, lost long before the first modern search began. Then there is a third possibility: the pillars were natural. Southern Arabia is home to strange and haunting rock formations, carved by wind and rare rains into towers and spires. To an ancient traveler, creasting a dune to see such formations would be unforgettable. If a settlement was built nearby, the city could easily be described as a place of lofty pillars. Over time, in the retelling, the difference between natural spires and human-made columns could blur until the pillars belonged entirely to the city in the story, not to the desert that shaped them. If we imagine the destruction of Iram, whether by divine storm, drought, or sinkhole, and picture these pillars, we can begin to see how they became such a powerful symbol. In a moment of catastrophe, they might have been the last thing standing, visible above the chaos, only to vanish soon after. Survivors could have carried the memory with them, passing it on in song and story. Over generations, those stories would become fixed as history, and the pillars would take on a life of their own. So why haven't we found them? The practical answer is that the search is far from over. At Shisr, often cited as the most promising candidate for Ubar, only a fraction of the site has been excavated. The surrounding dunes have not been fully surveyed with modern tools. Elsewhere in Yemen's Hadramaut region, in the UAE's interior, and in the unexplored depths of the Rub al-Khali, vast stretches of sand remain unexamined. Shifting dunes can bury a ruin one year and expose it the next. The desert plays a slow, patient game. The absence of pillars is one of the main reasons skeptics doubt Shisr's claim to be Ubar. Without them, they argue, the site is simply another caravan outpost. But this skepticism is not purely academic. Monumental architecture has an almost magical pull in archaeology. A pot shard or a collapsed wall might convince a scholar, but it is rows of columns and soaring facades that convince the world. They are the proof you can photograph, the proof that fills museums and textbooks. Without such finds, the public imagination is harder to capture, and the legend of Ubar, for some, remains just that, a legend. Technology may yet change this. Ground-penetrating radar, magnetometry, and satellite-based spectral imaging have the potential to reveal buried structures without moving a single grain of sand. If the pillars or even their foundations are still out there, these tools could find them. The challenge is scale. The regions in question are vast, remote, and difficult to work in. Detailed surveys would take months or years, and excavation would require both funding and political stability. But the reward to uncover the iconic pillars of Iram would be one of the most sensational discoveries in Middle Eastern archaeology. And yet, we must be prepared for another possibility, that the pillars will never be found because they never existed as we imagine them. In many ancient languages, the word translated as pillar could also mean chief, leader, or support. Iram of the pillars might have meant Iram of the great lineages, a poetic title, not a description of architecture. If so, the search for towering columns is not a search for history, but for a metaphor given form by our own expectations. Still, the image endures because it speaks to something universal. Columns, whether in the desert or the forest, are about aspiration. They rise above the horizontal sprawl of human life, reaching toward the sky. They are both functional and symbolic, a roof support, a marker of status, a defiance of gravity. Even if Iram's pillars existed only in the mind, they serve the same role as those of Persepolis or Karnak. They signal a center of power and culture. It is tempting to close your eyes and picture them as they might have been a caravan approaches from the south. The heat shimmering on the horizon. Out of the haze, shapes begin to appear, tall, slender, impossibly regular. As the camels draw closer, you see the intricate carvings spiraling up their lengths, the bases polished by countless feet, the air around them alive with voices and the rustle of goods. This is Iram of the Pillars, a place so proud of its architecture that it built its identity into its skyline. Whether those columns ever stood in stone, or were carved from palm trunks, or were nothing more than towering rock spires given meaning by proximity, they have achieved what all monuments dream of. They have survived the fall of their city by living on in the collective imagination. And perhaps that is the most fitting legacy for a city swallowed by sand, to be remembered not by what we can touch, but by what we can see in our mind's eye. Long before oil tankers crossed the Gulf and cargo jets shrank oceans to hours, there was a commodity in Arabia more precious than gold, more sought after than silver, and more jealously guarded than spices. It was the scent of gods and kings, frankincense and myrrh, the lifeblood of an ancient trade network that reached from the southern deserts to the temples of Egypt, the markets of Rome, and the altars of India. In that world, Ubar, or Iram, was said to be a crown jewel, not a city of conquerors, but a city of connectors. Standing astride one of the most lucrative commercial arteries in history, if the legend is true, caravans laden with sacks of resin pass through its gates in endless succession. The air so thick with aromatic smoke that the city itself must have smelled like a living altar. Frankincense trees grew only in a narrow belt of southern Arabia in what is now Oman, Yemen, and parts of Somalia. Their resin was harvested in a delicate process. The bark was scored with shallow cuts, and over days, the tree wept drops of milky sap that hardened into translucent beads. When burned, these gave off a smoke so sweet, so layered, that ancient peoples considered it a divine medium. Egyptian priests waved it before statues of the gods. Roman generals demanded it in victory processions. In the East, it was prized for medicine, perfume, and ritual. But resin does not walk to market by itself. It had to be carried mile after punishing mile, across some of the harshest terrain on Earth. Caravans of camels were the solution-living cargo trucks that could haul hundreds of pounds each, endure searing days without water, and navigate the shifting sand by memory and instinct. The incense routes formed a network stretching thousands of kilometers, and somewhere in that network, Ubar sat as a critical hub. Its location, wherever it truly was, would have been no accident. Successful trade cities in the desert were always built where two conditions met: control over resources and control over movement. Resources could be wells, oases, or grazing lands. Movement was the harder prize, the ability to funnel caravans along certain paths, often through narrow passes, wadis, or areas where navigation was easiest. If Ubar was built at such a crossroads, it could exact tolls, offer safe rest, and stockpile goods for resale, growing wealthy without producing a single drop of resin itself. Historical fragments hint at the scale of this economy. In the 1st century CE, the historian Pliny the Elder noted that the Roman Empire spent 100 million sesterces a year on luxury imports from Arabia and India, a staggering figure. Frankincense made up a significant share of that sum. Every bead of resin that reached Rome had passed through many hands, and each city along the way took its cut. For a place like Ubar, the profits could be immense. Imagine standing at the city's gates on a peak trading day. The air would shimmer with heat and scent. Camel bells would jingle, their tones softened by the dunes. Merchants in embroidered robes would haggle in a dozen tongues, from Sabaean to Greek. The warehouses would be packed with incense sacks, amphorae of oil, ingots of silver, bolts of dyed cloth, and always, in the background, the smell, that sweet, almost citrusy smoke that signaled both wealth and sanctity. If we believe the legends, Ubar's role was not merely to host caravans, but to manage the flow of the trade itself. Some sources suggest it acted as a clearinghouse, where goods from the south were consolidated and parceled into convoys for the long-haul north. Others propose it was a diplomatic center, where treaties between tribes ensured safe passage across otherwise hostile territory. In the desert, commerce and politics were inseparable. A city that could guarantee protection for hundreds of miles in either direction was worth more than any fortress. And yet, there is a puzzle. If Ubar was so central to this lucrative trade, why does it barely appear in surviving records? We have references in the Qur'an, in later Islamic geography, and in oral tradition, but almost nothing in the detailed Roman and Greek writings that describe other Arabian cities. Some scholars suggest This is because Ubar was known by another name in those sources. Others argue it may not have been a single city at all, but a shifting network of encampments whose location changed as water sources rose and fell. In that case, the City of the Pillars could be more of a conceptual capital, a headquarters for a tribe or confederation, than a permanent urban center in the modern sense. The incense trade was also cloaked in secrecy. Roots and water sources were guarded jealously, often treated as proprietary knowledge passed down within clans. Revealing too much could mean losing your competitive advantage to rivals. In such a climate, a city might be deliberately absent from foreign maps, not because it was unimportant, but because it was too important to advertise. It is here that the two great narratives of Ubar, the historical and the mythical, begin to weave together. The historical Ubar may have been a trade hub whose wealth came from geography and diplomacy. The mythical Ubar became a place of impossible opulence, where streets were paved with resin, where the scent of burning frankincense rose to the heavens, and where arrogance toward God brought about sudden destruction. The two are not mutually exclusive. Many real cities have been draped in legend until they stand half in history and half in imagination. The end of the incense trade offers another possible clue to Ubar's fate. By the early centuries CE, sea routes began to replace overland caravans for much long-distance trade. Ships could carry greater volumes at lower cost, and the discovery of monsoon wind patterns made travel between Arabia, India, and East Africa more predictable. As ports like Aden and Kana grew in prominence, inland trade hubs would have seen their importance and income dwindle. For a city like Ubar, this economic shift could have been catastrophic. Without caravans, there was no toll revenue, no market bustle, no reason for far-flung merchants to make the dangerous journey across the empty quarter. Add to this the possibility of environmental collapse, the overuse of wells, the shifting of sand dunes, the exhaustion of grazing lands, and you have the perfect recipe for abandonment. A city built on trade can survive war, even survive famine, but it cannot survive being cut out of the network that gave it life. And yet, the romance of Ubar's trading days lingers even now. The very idea of a desert city whose fortunes were measured in incense seems to belong to a different age. It speaks to a time when luxury was defined not by technology or conquest, but by the ability to make a room smell like paradise. The caravans that passed through Ubar were not carrying weapons or slaves, but something meant to please the senses and honor the divine. In this way, Ubar's story is a reminder that some of history's greatest fortunes were made not from iron or steel, but from smoke. The archaeological hunt for Ubar often focuses on the grandeur, the pillars, the walls, the sinkhole legends, but it is in the study of ancient trade routes that the city may finally be located with certainty. By mapping known frankincense-producing regions, recorded caravan paths, and ancient watering points, researchers can narrow the list of possible sites. In fact, it was satellite imagery of such caravan tracks that led to the 1990s excavation at Shisr. Whether Shisr is the real Ubar or just one of its many way stations remains hotly debated. But the method shows promise. Perhaps somewhere beneath the dunes lies a collapsed warehouse, its floor still dusted with grains of hardened resin, the faintest echo of its scent still trapped in the wood of a beam. To find such a place would be to bridge the gap between the Ubar of legend and the Ubar of history. It would tell us not only where the city stood, but how it lived and how it connected the distant corners of the ancient world. Until then, the image remains camels lined nose to tail, the desert wind carrying both heat and perfume, and a city that rose not because it conquered, but because it connected. Ubar's pillars may be gone, its walls may be buried, but its role as a node in the great incense trade still smolders in the imagination, like the last ember of frankincense on a dying coal. For centuries, the desert kept its secrets hidden under an unbroken skin of sand. The wind was its archivist, endlessly reshaping the surface, erasing footsteps, swallowing walls, and burying roads until memory itself began to doubt they'd ever existed. Then, in the late 20th century, we stopped looking with our eyes and started looking from space. In the early 1990s, a joint team from NASA and explorers on the ground began scanning the Arabian Peninsula with synthetic aperture radar. Unlike ordinary cameras, radar could see through thin layers of sand, revealing subtle differences in texture and density invisible to the human eye. In the vast, seemingly empty Rub al-Khali, the empty quarter, these scans revealed something remarkable: faint, bright streaks running across the desert, often straight for miles, then curving toward clusters of dots that might once have been wells or encampments. At first glance, they looked like veins in stone, branching and fading. But to the trained eye, these lines resembled tracks not from a few travelers, but from centuries of use. They seemed too consistent, too deliberate, to be the work of wind or water alone. The theory took shape. These could be the remnants of ancient caravan roads, packed firm by the passage of tens of thousands of camel hooves, running to and from a city that might have been Ubar. Imagine a caravan route as it existed at its height, over generations. The weight of loaded camels and the rhythm of their tread pressed the topsoil into a harder, lighter surface than the untouched sand around it. Rain, rare though it was, would run off differently, compacting the surface further. From the air, such paths could be lighter in tone, their lines stretching like faded ink across the dunes. These bright streaks in NASA's radar images matched the theory perfectly. But here's the catch: the desert plays tricks. Wind can scour certain areas more than others, leaving pale sand exposed. Flash floods in wadis can create natural channels that mimic the curves of man-made roads. Distinguishing between nature's handiwork and humanity's footprint is harder than it sounds, especially when the footprint in question might be thousands of years old. The debate erupted almost immediately. One camp of researchers hailed the streaks as hard evidence of ancient trade routes, their orientation and intersections lining up with known archaeological sites and the general geography of incense transport. Another camp urged caution, pointing out that without excavations along those lines, without finding the pottery shards, the fire pits, the collapsed wellheads, we could be chasing mirages painted in pixels. Still, the imagery had power. You could trace some of these lines from the Dhofar region, where frankincense trees still grow, northward and westward across the empty quarter. They converged near Shisr, where the 1990s excavation uncovered ruins above a massive sinkhole, a site many have linked to Ubar. From there, the lines fanned outward again, suggesting branches toward the Persian Gulf, toward Yemen, toward the great oasis towns that dotted the old overland routes. If they are indeed caravan tracks, the implications are enormous. It would mean we can map parts of the incense trade network with unprecedented precision. We could pinpoint choke points where caravans were forced through narrow passes, ideal spots for a trading city or a toll station. We could even estimate the scale of the trade by the density of the routes on the ground. However, the romance fades into difficulty. Many of the bright streak areas are hundreds of miles from modern roads, deep in terrain that shifts season to season. A line visible from space might vanish entirely under a new dune field by the time an expedition reaches it. The heat is punishing, the logistics expensive, and even with GPS, navigating in such landscapes is a test of endurance and patience. Those who have walked parts of these routes describe an eerie sensation. The sand underfoot feels different, firmer, almost crusted. Sometimes there are small scatterings of rock where no bedrock should be, as if ancient travelers laid down ballast or discarded stones from their loads. Occasionally, half-buried pottery emerges, so worn and unadorned that it could be anything from a water jar to a fragment of a cooking pot. Each shard invites the same question: was this dropped last century or last millennium? The debate over natural versus man-made intensifies when you consider the scale. Some streaks are so broad they could only have formed through geological forces, while others are narrow and parallel, like the ruts of a twin-track road. In some places, streaks meet at angles that seem planned, like the intersection of highways. In others, they dissolve into fan shapes that could be either a caravan spreading out or a flood dispersing sediment. The line between pattern and coincidence blurs, and in the desert, blurred lines can fool even the most experienced observer. Satellite technology continues to evolve, and with it, our ability to see beneath the sand improves. Modern multispectral imaging can differentiate between mineral compositions, potentially telling us whether a streak is compacted earth from trampling or simply a patch of lighter sand. LiDAR, which uses lasers instead of radio waves, can pick out subtle topographical changes that hint at buried structures along these lines. Each new advance raises the hope that we might finally separate the true caravan roads from nature's forgeries. Yet there is also a philosophical question at play. If the desert has erased most of the physical traces, does the pattern itself, visible only from orbit, count as real evidence? In archaeology, context is everything. A road without artifacts is just a guess. But in history, patterns matter. The fact that these streaks align with what we know about ancient trade geography, with the locations of oases, with the distribution of frankincense trees, makes the guess a compelling one. And there is another layer to this mystery, the human one. For generations, Bedouin guides have spoken of hidden roads in the sands, paths known only to their tribes, passed down orally. These paths often match the general direction of the radar streaks. It's tempting to imagine that the knowledge of these routes, even if the physical road is gone, has survived in memory and practice, guiding travelers across an otherwise trackless expanse. If Ubar was indeed a node in this network, then the caravan roads are its lifelines, the arteries that kept the city alive. Following them back through time could lead us not just to a ruin, but to an understanding of how a city could thrive in such an inhospitable place. It would explain how goods moved, how cultures met, and how wealth flowed into a city that has now all but vanished. But the desert keeps its counsel. For every expedition that returns with hopeful photographs and GPS coordinates, another comes back with empty hands and the quiet knowledge that the sands do not give up their stories easily. The bright streaks on the NASA images are like whispers. You can hear them, but you cannot be certain what they're saying. In the end, the ancient desert roads, whether carved by camels or sculpted by wind, remain part of Ubar's shadow. They may be proof of the city's role in the great incense trade, or they may be nothing more than the world's largest case of pareidolia. seeing patterns where none exist. Either way, they draw the eye, pulling the imagination along their pale paths toward a city that may or may not be waiting at the end. And perhaps that is the most fitting tribute the desert can give, a trail you can see from the heavens, but not follow on earth, leading always toward the horizon, where history and myth blur into the same heat-shimmering line. If you start digging into the story of Ubar not with a shovel, but with words, you quickly find yourself straying far beyond archaeology and into the realm of myth. It's not that the evidence disappears, it's that it gets tangled up in a web of other tales, each sticky with centuries of retelling. Pull one thread, and you find it tied to Atlantis. Tug another, and you're deep in the pages of 1001 Nights. Pull again, and you're in the wind-scoured deserts of Bedouin lore, hearing whispers of an ice city shimmering somewhere beyond the dunes. This is the problem and the allure of Ubar. It's never just a set of ruins. It's a crossroads where real-world history meets the kind of stories that refuse to stay politely in their own lane. Take the comparison to Atlantis. At first, it seems almost lazy, a city that vanished, swallowed by the earth, remembered only in legend. Well, of course, people think of Atlantis. Plato's lost island has been the template for every vanished civilization story in the Western imagination for over 2 millennia. But dig a little deeper, and you find that the parallels aren't entirely superficial. Atlantis, in Plato's telling, was punished for arrogance and advanced people who grew corrupt, inviting divine wrath. Ubar's Quranic counterpart, Iram of the Pillars, is described in almost identical terms, a mighty city whose people defied God, only to be erased by a catastrophic act of nature. In both, the destruction is swift, total, and moralized as deserved. But here's the tricky bit. Once a legend is compared to Atlantis, it rarely escapes that gravitational pull. Researchers start to frame their questions in terms of, is it real? Rather than, what exactly was it? As though history needs to pick a side between fact and fiction. For Ubar, this means any real archaeological work is constantly in conversation with a ghost story that doesn't belong to it. Then there's Iram al-Imad, Iram of the Pillars, from 1001 Nights. This is where things get stranger. The Qur'an calls it the city of lofty pillars, the like of which was never created in the land, and the Arabian Nights expands that into a jeweled, otherworldly place. In some versions, its towers are so tall they disappear into clouds. In others, they gleam like crystal under the desert sun. The city is ruled by a king named Shaddad, who hears of paradise and decides to build his own. Naturally, this kind of pride doesn't end well. He's struck down before he can set foot in his creation, and the city itself is swallowed by the sands. What makes this connection particularly potent is that the Arabian Nights, though literary, is built on centuries of oral storytelling. The stories shifted, adapted, and absorbed real-world elements as they traveled. By the time the tales were written down, they were already a tapestry woven from fact and invention. So when modern archaeologists or historians look at Iram in the Qur'an, they're not just dealing with a single source. They're dealing with a river of stories that has branched, merged, and doubled back on itself over centuries. And then, if that weren't enough, there's the Bedouin legend of the lost ice city. It's an odd one to associate with Ubar. Ice is not the first thing you think of in the Rub al-Khali, but the story persists, somewhere in the deep desert. So the tale goes, there is a place where ice walls rise from the sand, glittering in the sun. Some versions say it's a mirage, others that it's an ancient city frozen in time. The name changes with the teller, but the bones of the tale are the same, a place utterly out of place, unreachable except to those who already know where it is. It's not hard to see why this legend has been folded into the Ubar mythos. Both are about a hidden city in the desert. Both are elusive to the point of vanishing. And in the minds of storytellers, why not merge them? If a city can be swallowed by sand, why can't it also be locked in ice? In the space between what's physically possible and what's narratively satisfying, anything can happen. The trouble for historians is that every time Ubar gets linked to one of these other myths, it becomes harder to separate what's plausible from what's poetic. Did the people of Ad really build pillars the likes of which had never been seen? Or did a later storyteller borrow that image from a memory of Egyptian obelisks, or the towering columns of Palmyra, or even from the minarets of their own time? When someone describes the sands swallowing a city, is that a geological sinkhole, a massive dune migration, or simply a metaphor for forgetting? This blending of myth and memory isn't just an obstacle, it's a survival mechanism. Stories last longer than stones. A building can crumble, be buried, or be looted for its bricks, but a story can move from mouth to mouth, crossing centuries intact enough to spark a search. Without the Qur'an's verses, without the Arabian Nights' embroidered details, without the Bedouins' strange tales, would anyone have gone looking for Ubar at all? And so archaeologists walk a narrow line. They can't dismiss the legends outright, because sometimes they preserve kernels of truth. At the same time, they can't take them literally, or risk chasing an image that was never real to begin with. The challenge is to use myth as a map, but to remember it's a map drawn in metaphor, not scale. There's also the possibility that the legends aren't about Ubar at all, but about a pattern. Across the world, there are dozens of vanished city stories in the sands, under the sea, beneath volcanic ash. They serve as cautionary tales, as symbols of impermanence, as reminders that power can be undone in an instant. Perhaps Ubar has simply become Arabia's version of a story humanity tells itself over and over, changing only the setting. But if that's the case, the persistence of the name is even more remarkable. Atlantis has become shorthand for any sunken world. Ubar remains stubbornly Ubar. The specifics of its geography, the empty quarter, the incense trade, the towering pillars anchor it in a real place. Even as the details slip between the fingers, you can't quite dismiss it as pure invention, because the landscape itself seems to collaborate with the story. You stand in the desert, look at the endless dunes, and think, yes, this is exactly where something could vanish, and no one would ever find it again. Modern explorers, both academic and amateur, often admit to being lured as much by the romance of the legends as by the promise of hard data. A ground-penetrating radar scan might find a collapsed well. A local elder might tell of a caravan that never returned. The two types of evidence sit side by side, neither proving nor disproving the other. In that in-between space, the search continues. And perhaps that's the real link between Ubar and its legendary cousins. Atlantis, Iram, the ice city, none of them are ever found in a way that satisfies everyone. Even when a candidate site is discovered, there's always enough ambiguity left over for the debate to continue. Certainty is the one thing these stories refuse to give, which might explain their enduring pull. In a world where so much has been mapped, measured, and explained, the idea that something as grand as a city could still be missing, could still be just over the horizon. Hidden by sand or sea or snow is intoxicating. Whether it's the blue-green waves over Atlantis, the golden dunes over Ubar, or the glittering ice walls of the Bedouin Tale, the image is the same, a place waiting to be rediscovered. Even if it only exists in the human imagination, Ubar's connection to these other legends may blur its historical outline, but it also keeps it alive. Facts can be buried, myths tend to float. As long as people are telling stories about lost cities, Ubar will have a place among them, a half-seen shape moving in the mirage. Forever, just far enough away to keep us walking toward it. If there's one thing the desert excels at, it's hiding what it has already taken. Ubar, or what may be Ubar, is no exception. For all the grand claims about its discovery in the 1990s, for all the radar scans and archaeological surveys, the truth is stark. Most of it is still under there. Under sand, under time, under the stubborn refusal of the empty quarter to give up its secrets. When you first look at the site at Shisr, the most widely cited candidate for Ubar's remains, it doesn't scream lost city. There are no intact colonnades, no golden gates shimmering in the sun. What you see instead are the outlines of crumbled walls, the weathered bones of a stone fort, and a yawning sinkhole that drops into shadow. It's the sort of place you might drive past without a second glance if you didn't already know what you were looking for. And even the archaeologists know they've only scratched the surface. Literally, the excavation here has been partial, selective, and cautious. Some of that is by necessity. The desert's top layer is not a friendly medium. It moves constantly. A site painstakingly cleared one year can be half buried again by the next season's sandstorms. And those storms don't just cover, they erode. Sharp winds carve away at exposed structures, wearing centuries-old stone as easily as a file wears down wood. That means every new trench dug has to be balanced against the risk of exposing something the elements will destroy faster than it can be documented. Access is another obstacle. Shisr is remote even by Oman standards. The roads into the Rub al-Khali are not the kind you take lightly. Long stretches offer no shade, no fuel, and no margin for error. A broken axle or a dead engine isn't an inconvenience out here. It's a threat to your life. And when your excavation requires not just people, but heavy equipment, every extra mile into the desert adds complexity and cost. And cost, of course, is the other constant. Archaeology anywhere is expensive. Archaeology in a place that actively resists being excavated, that's a budget that gets tight very quickly. International funding tends to favor projects with visible, photogenic results, the kind of dig that produces statues, inscriptions, or temples that can be splashed on magazine covers. Ubar offers no such guarantee. The payoff here might be a few more meters of wall, or a collapsed chamber whose contents are too fragile to remove. Those finds excite specialists, but they don't sell postcards. As a result, large swaths of the supposed city have never been touched by a trowel. Ground-penetrating radar has hinted at subterranean structures beyond the main excavation area, possible roadways, foundation lines, even voids that could be buried rooms. But hinted is the key word. Without digging, there's no way to confirm. Without funding, there's no way to dig. And without the ability to protect what's uncovered, there's little appetite to take the risk. In the meantime, the desert continues its slow, deliberate work. The dunes shift, sometimes meters in a season, recovering places where walls were once revealed. Sinkholes open unpredictably, swallowing sections of the site. This is not a static ruin, like a castle on a hill. It is a ruin in motion, a site that changes shape even as it is being studied. For archaeologists, that creates an odd tension. Ubar may be better preserved underground than above it. The sands that hide it also shield it from the weather, from looters, and from the curious hands of tourists. Pull too much into the light too quickly, and you risk losing what you've found. And yet, leaving it buried feels like an unfinished sentence. The allure of Ubar, the reason it stirs imaginations far beyond the academic world, is tied to the idea of revelation. A city swallowed by sand begs to be unswallowed. Every traveler who stands at Shisr looks toward the dunes and wonders what else is under there. How much more is left to find? The frustrating answer is possibly quite a lot. The fort visible today may have been only the latest layer in a settlement with a much deeper history. Pottery fragments suggest occupation over many centuries. Trade records hint that caravans were stopping here long before the fort's construction. If the site was indeed a hub for the incense trade, there would have been storerooms, workshops, wells, and perhaps a whole cluster of dwellings spread beyond the fort's perimeter. None of that has been fully mapped, let alone excavated. Then there's the sinkhole. Local tradition speaks of it swallowing buildings whole, a dramatic image, but not entirely implausible. The collapse appears to have opened into a natural cavity, perhaps enlarged by water erosion over centuries. Some archaeologists believe older structures may lie at its base, preserved like artifacts in a jar. Exploring it, however, would require specialized equipment, expert cavers, and significant safety measures in a place where every piece of gear must be brought in across unforgiving terrain. That's no small order. The partial nature of the excavation also leaves room for doubt and for debate. Skeptics of the Ubar identification point out that without a complete survey, it's risky to draw conclusions. What if the real city, or what's left of it, lies kilometers away, under a dune no one has bothered to probe? What if Shisr was only a way station, and the pillars of Iram stood elsewhere entirely? In the absence of a full excavation, those questions remain not just open, but inevitable. This uncertainty feeds into the legend. If Ubar were fully unearthed tomorrow, if every stone were catalogued and every street mapped, the mystery would shrink. The romance of the lost city would give way to something more precise, more mundane, still fascinating to archaeologists, perhaps, but less potent to the popular imagination. By remaining half-hidden, Ubar occupies a sweet spot real enough to believe in, elusive enough to dream about. It's not the first site to live in that liminal state. The ruins of Troy were once dismissed as pure myth until Heinrich Schliemann's excavations in the 19th century, but even then, the exact layers he unearthed sparked decades of argument over which, if any, matched Homer's Iliad. Machu Picchu, though now one of the most photographed places on Earth, was once a near secret known to local farmers. Its full story still not entirely pinned down even after a century of study. Ubar, with its sand-shrouded foundations, could remain in this twilight for decades more. The irony is that the very conditions preventing a complete excavation, the shifting sands, the remoteness, the expense, are also what have protected the site. Were Ubar located in a fertile, accessible valley, it might long ago have been quarried for stone or paved over by modern construction. The desert, indifferent and patient, has kept it intact enough to tantalize, So the archaeologists return in fits and starts, carving away at the dunes a little at a time. Each visit is a negotiation: how much to uncover, how much to leave, how to stretch a budget across a site that could swallow a dozen seasons of work without showing its full extent. They know that a single season's wind can undo months of labor. They know that the ground beneath them may shift, that an excavation trench may collapse in the heat of the day. They also know that every grain of sand they remove is one closer to whatever truth lies beneath. Perhaps someday, satellite technology or new excavation methods will tip the balance, allowing the site to be explored more fully without destroying it in the process. Until then, Ubar remains partly in the realm of the imagination, a city drawn in partial lines, the rest sketched in by the mind's eye. And maybe that's as it should be. Some places, once fully revealed, lose a little of their magic. But a place half hidden, a place that exists in equal measure on maps and in myth, that's a place that keeps people coming back, not just with shovels, but with stories